Okay, I'll take my POIs verbally, please. As weird as the reason may be, the joy you get from fulfilling an intimate desire is something that is incredibly powerful and intimate and often overrides other circumstantial pain you may feel in the short term. On our side of the house, animals live better and happier lives, and for this reason, we're very proud to propose. What is sentience in general and in this debate? Sentience is the ability to reflect and to recognize your own existence, and it is often accompanied with a higher degree of rationalization, which is necessarily the case because this rationalization is what allows you to self-reflect in the first place. So this is the difference between just experiencing emotional impulses because of your external conditions and the ability to have some conscious thought about your external circumstances, which is the rationalization we are talking about. With that being said, there's 2 points for you today. First, on why we minimize pain for animals. Secondly, on why we get better respect for animals and get more humane treatment within the farming industry. So on minimizing pain, note that livestock in the status quo still feel immense amounts of pain, even if they're not sentient. They still feel agony when their head is on the chopping block. They still feel suffocated when they're crammed into tiny enclosures. And they still feel sorrow when they watch their baby chicks or pigs be ripped away from them. But note that this suffering is oftentimes inevitable, where there's always going to be some form of industry farming to like feed the people around the world. But the crucial difference is that for these animals that inevitably have to be subjected to industry farming, this desire is that if we're able to reframe the suffering that they feel when they're being farmed or being slaughtered in the first place. And there's 3 reasons as to why this is the case. Number 1, fulfilling your desires often gives you happiness or satisfaction. It is quite intuitive in general, where desire is some form of longing or craving, like you crave food when you are hungry. And the moment at which you satisfy the desire gives you a sense of happiness and joy that often overrides the pain you feel in the short term. But secondly, know that pain is often biologically capable of being something that is rewired to be pleasurable, which is not impossible. Where like some people unironically are masochists, where to derive joy from pain or suffering, which is also why some people oftentimes also enjoy roller coasters or horror movies, where conflicting emotions can rewire other emotions into being pleasurable. And these emotions can be biologically rewired to become positive. I'll take you after the 3rd point. The 3rd mechanism is that you can use your sentience to rationalize your pain, where animals oftentimes suffer in the short term as well. Before they're being slaughtered, they're forced to stay in cramped enclosures. They watch their friends die around them. They watch their babies be ripped from them as well. These are all things that already affect animals to some degree in the status quo. But the difference is that when you have the capacity to rationalize, you can mitigate your short-term pain because you know it's going to serve a greater end and greater gratification in the long term. And this is why oftentimes for many students, you're able to put up with things like studying intense hours every single day, because you know it's going to lead to greater emotional payoff when you get good grades or you get into that university. And when you know that is the end outcome, and when you know that that is what you're working towards, that mitigates the pain you feel in the short term as well. So animals that otherwise are already experiencing suffering just because of their external circumstances can now rationalize and mitigate that under our side of the house. I'll take a POI.
If a pyromaniac wants to set buildings on fire, would you allow it?
No, but these animals, that doesn't change the fact that these animals still have a limited capacity to like do anything dangerous. And humans still have greater cognitive functions and probably rationalization capacity in relation to animals. So no. So what the first point proves then is that animals who are still going to inevitably be stuck in industry farming are going to be happier and in less pain under our side of the house. We think this is more humane and results in net suffering overall. But the second argument is that we have more respect for these animals. And this is the fact because we treat animals with sentience with more respect and we perceive them as being worthy of more dignity. And the impact of the claim that we're trying to prove here is that we can probably have a better and more humane farming industry where we no longer result in incredibly cramped enclosures, where animals probably receive better medical treatments, and we still have less abusive treatments like the farming of duck liver, where we overfeed ducks to bloat their liver to extremely painful degrees, or perhaps we invest in more painless methods of euthanasia. But the second thing I want to observe then is this motion also takes place in a this house prefers a world motion, right? Where you don't have to accept all aspects of the status quo, like the massive lobbying power of the farming industry. We're in an alternate world where this was the norm, where this was like what was consistent throughout all of history. It is less likely that the farming industry would have been as powerful in the first place, no thank you, and that we respected animals more from the very beginning. And the mechanism as to why we get greater empathy for these animals is that humans attribute a great degree of importance towards the ability to self-rationalize. Where rationality is necessary for concepts like choice or free will, that we often place a great degree of importance is. Where rationality unlocks concepts like autonomy, it's often what we perceive give our lives meaning, and sentience is a crucial part in defining our identity as human and necessary for autonomy and a sense of individuality, which is what we think defines our rights to things like respect or life or any form of dignity. It all boils down to the ability to rationalize and to have autonomy. But secondly, I would also just argue on a biological level, we care more about animals because when they seem closer to ourselves, because it becomes easier to invoke our sense of empathy. We empathize with things we can relate to more because it becomes easier to put ourselves in their shoes. And that's why we care a lot about monkeys and apes, and in general, why we relate more to mammals and like marine life. But this shows that the closer we get to something and the more human-like characteristics something has, the more we care about them. So this means that animal rights movements often become more powerful under our side of the house. Where in the status quo, we often see animals as subhuman, nothing more than a slab of meat in the grocery store. But now you can focus more on emphasizing how these animals are more similar to humans. We can promote studies that show how they interact with their children similar to human mothers. We can promote studies that show how chickens can think and adapt and solve puzzles similar to a human child or a human baby. We can have studies that portray them more closer to humans on a cognitive level. And this garners more sympathy from the average citizen, where they perceive these animals as deserving of more respect and therefore are more willing to have a sense of moral outrage when they're not treated with dignity. Overall, we think they have more buy-in to activist movements that campaign for them to be treated humanely because they are seen as more deserving of respect. But the second crucial mechanism that also to contend with here is that this also aligns more with existing legal precedent on how we instrumentalize animals, where things like rats in scientific experiments are often already instrumentalized for scientific knowledge. And when they are discovered to be quite intelligent and sentient, this resulted in legal requirements on how they must be treated with a certain amount of dignity, and you can't infinitely exploit them, which is why you can't do things like torture rats, and you must treat them with a certain degree of respect. And this makes it easier for the movement to create change, given that there is already existing legal precedents in other areas of the scientific community. But the farming industry is another system in which we instrumentalize animals for our own gain. But now these animals are also shown to be quite intelligent and quite sentient, where these individuals and movements can also rely on existing legal precedent, where they have some grounds to actually create change through courts, even if you don't buy the previous mechanism of getting more political will by virtue of having more buy-in to these activist movements. And this is incredibly important because compare this to the status quo, where many of these animals aren't sentient in the status quo in general, where there's less justification for them to be treated with respect and dignity because they're perceived as being subhuman or perceived as being less deserving of autonomy and respect in certain cases. So what is the impact at the end of the day and at the end of this point? We prove why these animals actually get treated more humanely under our side of the house. But this is a world in which the farming industry does not have a chokehold over politics, where they're less likely to have the massive lobbying power by accruing massive profit margins that gives them this political power in the first place. Or from the very beginning, this is a world in which these animals were sentient, where we probably approached them and treated them with more dignity and respect. But it's also a world in which we probably had more dialogue about the concept of sentience from the very beginning, given that many of these commonplace farm animals are sentient to some degree, so that this concept is probably going to be more prevalent throughout mainstream discourse. So the concept of animals and animal rights is probably more normalized throughout society as well, by virtue of this being taking a larger place in mainstream discourse. For all these reasons, animals get treated better, they're fundamentally deserving of dignity, and we care about the fact that they're currently being instrumentalized and abused. We're very proud to propose.
Great, thank you for that speech. For that, I would like to call upon the first prop whenever you're ready. Yeah. First prop.
Okay, am I both audible and visible?
Yep, you are.
All right, thanks. So my time will start in 3, 2, 1. So before I move on to a few key pieces of framing and the first two arguments, let me first rebut to the previous speaker. First of all, they said that short-term harm is okay as animals will serve a greater purpose in the future. Speaker, since when was the greater purpose of animals to serve meat for humans? This is a harmful narrative that humans have set up in the past, meaning that we should change it. So we believe that it is unjustified to force animals to believe that their only purpose is to die, as that was not the reason why they were created in the first place. Number two, they said that we can have more respect to animals by having a more humane meat industry. We know that animals, however, speaker, in the status quo, we know that animals have feelings and want to live, right? And we still still see a lot of maltreatment given towards these animals. But if animals can rationalize their own pain on side proposition, why will people care about providing a better care and meat industry for these animals when they think that these animals want to die anyways? We do not understand why this is true. Third of all, they said that they get sympathy because humans and animals will be considered as being similar. Speaker, we do not understand how they are similar to humans when they live to die, especially as they're genetically engineering these animals. Please, we would like the next speaker to come up and clarify how the mechanism towards this. Okay, now that we have that set, I'd like to move on to framing. Number one, what is sentience? We believe that sentience is the state of an animal having their own will, feeling, thoughts, and are able to take actions based on those thoughts that were created by themselves. So when animals are wanting to be eaten, following side proposition, we believe that their will is to only die for the purpose of providing meat for humans, and that is the only reason for their existence. Side proposition's characterization as sentient to be knowing that they're alive, that itself is not the true definition of being sentient. Number two, the trend in today's society regarding livestock consumption. We see an increasing consensus, especially within the younger generation, that it is immoral for us humans to continue to slaughter livestock and abuse them. And this idea was spread especially through social media and more. The main reason why this idea of veganism or limiting the amount of meat consumption is on the rise is that people are starting to realize that animals are sentient and have feelings, meaning that they're aware that they're getting killed or whatnot and did not want to get killed. And this is what made people to start feeling empathy for these animals and realize that they are also living beings just like us. And we believe that these vegan movements are turning out to be highly effective, as we already see quote unquote vegan meat that is made out of peas and more to have the taste of meat but stop these abuses against the animals, meaning that these veganism movements are actually effective. Number three, so what world does side opposition want? We want to live in a world where animals' rights and dignity is respected by being able to provide their life with a true purpose that is set by themselves, and that is actually for the animals themselves and not for any other entity, which are humans. So what am I going to prove to you in my speech? Number one, I'm going to prove to you why passing this policy is morally unjust, and secondly, why the continuance of the meat industry is impractical. Moving on to the first argument about why generating livestock in this fashion is inherently immoral. No living being should be born to die. Why is this true? Number one, on human obligation. We believe that livestock have been bred in small shelters, ripped away from their mothers and held captive against their own will. Humans have an obligation to not have provided a world in which these animals were not given any dignity or agency, because how much we have already detrimented these animals through these abusive actions, right? We need to be able to see other living beings and respect them instead of treating them as lower than us just because they're animals or whatnot. And although it took a long time for us to realize that in the status quo, with the change and leaning towards veganism, it is only an extension of this trend to not pass today's policy. Secondly, on this action itself being immoral. I'd like to take away another preconception in this debate. To want to die, to feel hopeful instead of sad when one of your own race dies, is something immoral, despite the fact that they might have conditioned into wanting it. If someone who is born into slavery says, quote unquote, I was meant to be a slave, that does not mean that we should allow this slavery to continue to happen. The debate tells us this animal is sentient. Pyromaniacs want to set fires, but we discourage them from doing so, right? This is because the person who is enslaving the other is still doing so with malicious intent to be able to dominate the other living being, although they're both living beings, meaning that the entire dignity and purpose of a human has been decided and genetically engineered by another. And we believe that the same logic applies towards these animals. We believe, what does this look like? We believe that number one, we have to recognize the environments that these animals will live in. Let's look at a world in which animals live in the status quo. When organizations like PETA goes on investigations to see how livestock are treated, they're usually filled with horrific scenes, filled with animal abuses, cows being barely able to move, separated at birth from their parents, chickens cooped up with pens that have hundreds of chickens alongside them, and some animals are even trampled to death. They're never washed, never tranquilized, and etc. We paint you this image because this horrific scene will just get worse on side proposition, especially because they're genetically engineering these animals to rationalize their own pain. This means that humans will have no empathy at all to try to change these kind of living conditions of these animals, because they know that because they made their sole purpose to only serve humans, meaning that they have no dignity and no respect towards these animals at all. I'll take that POI later. However, we thought on side opposition, because we have the rise of veganism and because we realize that people are starting to realize that these animals are human beings, we can at least decrease this pain to a certain extent. So what is the world in which these livestock will have on side opposition? We believe that number one, these animals will be considered as even less as we believe that these animals will be considered as even less as living creatures on side proposition, less places to live, and even more cooped up. These animals, when they feel that they are sufficiently fat, will actively try to die to serve these kind of humans. They will run into weapons to die for animals. The pens of animals will be filled with unsanitary deaths of animals, and the animals and the humans won't care. We believe that there are less ways to kill these animals ethically that will be used. If they want to die, the butchers will not see the reason to kill them with just straight out weapons. These animals will still feel pain, which is very bad. Why is this important? We believe that the sole purpose of animals, when they were first created, includes their natural instinct of wanting to live, wanting to freely move around and more. And we believe that side population one is the one who is actively getting rid of this natural instinct of these animals in the very get-go and diminishing the reason of their existence just because of the humans wanting, which is not even a need to have meat. How does this matter, we believe that we have to recognize the difference between physical and mental genetic engineering and the loss of dignity. We have to realize that dignity is important, as the Prime Minister also came up and explained. An animal has inherent value because it leads life, uses its ability to experience its environment, seeks what is pleasant, and tries to avoid the unpleasant, right? That is why they have sentience. That is why they have sentience. The dignity of human beings is injured when they're degraded and humiliated, and we believe that the same applies towards these animals. Now, before I move on to the second argument, I'll take a POI.
The world you describe is the status quo, where animals have terrible living conditions. You say that veganism is a change for this, but veganisms are laughed at by the vast majority of society in the status quo. How then do you meaningfully make these lives better on your side of the house?
Numerous examples about why these kind of veganism movements are effective by showing you how there are an increase of like vegan meat or whatnot, proving that there is a rise in people supporting these kind of veganist movements. And we have also told you why on your side there will be an exponential growth in the meat consumption industry, because people realize they do not have a feeling within their own will. Right, so we believe that that would get worse on your side. Secondly, the second argument is about how this further legitimizes consumption of meat. Why is this true? Since people will know that these livestock want to be eaten, they will use this as an excuse to consume more meat and continue the malicious actions against them. They will not feel any remorse when they kill animals. Rather than feeling that they have to hurt these animals, they would rather think that they are doing a favor for these animals because they want to die anyways. Right? What does this look like? We believe that this looks like people wanting to consume more and more meat because they do not feel that they're doing something wrong. They do not realize that is morally wrong, and that the animals actually want it. But as explained in our first argument, we have told you why it is wrong principally that animals should be killed just for the purpose of human consumption. It doesn't make it any better that these animals don't feel that way. We think that it is still immoral. Why is this important? On side proposition, we won't be able to stop the meat industry in any way. We believe that this will never stop because even if the industry wanted to let some out, they can't, because when the animals are let free, they'll immediately die by getting eaten by whatever predator that they meet, as they do not have instincts to run away from them, as they have genetically engineered them to be that way, right? Well, how does this matter? We believe that killing animals or any human beings are not moral and cannot be moral on either side of the house, as killing increases on the side by legitimizing their actions. People will not feel guilt after killing and consuming these livestock. We believe that we are not able to stop this meat industry in redefining the full purposes of the livestock, because following side proposition, the mistreatment and malnutrition animals will rather increase on side proposition, because no humans ever will feel remorse towards the animals and never realize that the actions that they are taking are wrong, because they will feel like they're doing a favor and they're letting these animals achieve their own purposes, which they forcefully embedded within the minds of these animals, right? And therefore, we believe that side opposition wins today's debate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that speech. For that, I would like to call upon the second up. Continue. Yeah.
Am I both audible, and visible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, thank you. So my preferred pronouns are she and her, and I'll like my POIs verbally. And if everyone's ready, I'd like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to die. I want to die. I want to die. This is what is going on in the heads of animals. It isn't that they have more thoughts that make them more closer to humans. No, their point on more animal rights falls right on the bat when they say that people have closer connections to animals are similar to themselves, like chimpanzees. By genetically modifying, we are distancing ourselves from these livestock. People have no connection to these animal lives because they do not think from normal people that I want to die. Why will they want to help these animals by giving them more rights? These livestock will be seen as no different than plants. These plants have no feelings, so do animals. At least plants do not want to die. Animals, they're even less than the plants on their side. They actually want and incentivize the humans to die. Do plants have forms of plant rights? No, we're so proud to oppose. So before moving on to our third argument, we will first have to rebut to the previous speaker. So first they talked about how there's going to be better treatments of animals. We believe that this is very problematic because on your side, as they are very sentient, although their intelligence might not be sophisticated as compared to humans on the side proposition, they can still perceive things as they have feelings, right? So when animals are also sentient in your case, your point just goes on to prove why they should treat these animals well, which isn't going to happen because there are not going to be animal rights, like I just proved in my introduction. And they also talked about how they hold corporations more accountable. Although animals can feel things, we believe that if all corporations knew that livestock whole purpose is to provide red meat for humans, and again, think about dying from day one since they're born as
they're born. Well, what do you think will actually incentivize these corporations to stop their actions? Given that your rebuttal about how veganism movements are not working, even when we know that animals don't want to die, what makes you actually think that these corporations will also change to your side? Well, this is going to even further on create a bigger market for these red meats and create like a lot of money for these red meat industries, which is not supposed to happen, because we're supposed to say that even at the worst case, these red meat is bad for humans on certain spectrums, and that's why veganism and vegetarian exist, because there are some health benefits that are very bad for these humans when we're consuming a lot of red meat. So at the end of the day, they should be also pushing for like very bad. They should be pushing for like less meat eating as well. And they also point out third that a major problem comes in here when they say that animals are sentient and they can express emotions. Side proposition is being so wishy-washy in the characterization, because they said animals cannot perceive anything, and that's why we should treat them as lower than us. But then they say that they have feelings and can express those emotions, meaning that they can perceive those information well and have their own beings. And finally, they talked about in this point about how they have legal frameworks existing to prevent animal abuse cases. Legal frameworks also still exist on our side, but following your characterization, these laws don't work. There's no mechanization on why these laws will certainly strengthen on your side, when we already proven to from our first argument that these legal frameworks clearly do not work, and it's going to be worsened on your side. And the second point that was major was that they talked about how that does not lead to humans consuming even more meat because of empathy. How is there empathy on their side? We already proved this multiple times. You see that there are people who treat animals as lower classes because they're stupid, and that is true in the status quo, and it's going to be worsened on their side, because their only emotion and their only critical thinking is that they want to die to serve people on a platter. The animals that have even less dignity on your side, because they do not have a purpose and the will to set themselves by just emotions. How will this bring empathy? We want their next speaker to please engage on this point. And third, they talk about how the vegan movement has no globalization. We have 2 points. First, there's no evidence to this, because we believe that there are points to veganism succeeding, because there are restaurants that are opening up that are vegan. There are stores having more vegan food, etc. There's vegan commercialization that's happening in the status quo. They cannot just ignore these points and say that there's no globalization with no mechanization in there. It will be that even if veganism fails, there's still vegetarianism, and vegetarianism is very successful in the status quo for a very long time. It's very prevalent, and we have that structure, that fundamental structure that was happening for years and years. The proposition side cannot say that it just suddenly failed from one liner that they provided for veganism. But fourth and foremost, but most importantly, insofar as animals are going to die, they said that they should die at least ethically. Will be that if they're born to die, every second that they're living, Mr. and Madam Speaker, is going to be painful for them, because they're thinking that they want to die to serve humans, to be on a platter that's like very like medium rare or whatnot. That's not going to happen when they're living. From the day that they're born, they will have the idea that they want to die, but they're not going to be allowed to die by humans, and that we believe is animal abuse in that case. On the proposition, the animals are going to have a painful life. As much as they hate on dying on our side, they will hate on living on ours. On proposition, they live to die, and happiness only exists when they reach the point of death and slaughter. We said this is much more miserable life that proposition gives compared to our side. Because let's look at the very, very, very best case that they prove. Even if they say that they give the most incredibly good quality environment to live in, treat them good and more, they can never win on the point of having and actually giving a good life to animals, such as these animals are simply will feel pain in their whole life simply because they are alive. And furthermore, we that no matter what side proposition says, they will never change that killing animals are immoral. As proposition side kills more animals, we win. And we that when they say that they will actually don't care about how they're gonna kill more animals and whatnot, they're acting very immoral. And when there's the point that these animals will not be considered as even animals, and to the point to disgrace as to levels of plants, they will not use euthanasia or whatnot. They will simply be killing these animals. However, the point is, even if they want to die, the death is not going to be very peaceful. This is a trigger warning. However, let's give examples of people who are suicidal. Just because these people want to die, when they're dying, or when they try to hurt themselves, it is very painful for them. We believe this is the same for animals. These animals, just because they have thought of death, they will not suddenly be like willing to be jumping in the jumping in the blades and saying that, oh, it's like so like good for me when they're dying or whatnot. They will still feel pain when they're dying. So this is very harmful. And we believe that they should push on the burden that there's no mechanization on the point of cats and dogs and the POI that we just mentioned. So we want the next speaker to talk about this. And before moving on, I'd like to accept the POI.
So just because I consent to medical euthanasia, does this justify me being tortured while I'm still alive?
So we believe that euthanasia is going to be fine. However, that doesn't exist on your side. At least we have euthanasia, and we're gonna have more morally, ethically ways for animals to die on our side, because and we believe that we're gonna push for more humane like treatments on, because they are on the same level as humans, or at least people are going to push the movement to be as such. So argument 3, this destroys the animal. This destroys the environment. Why is this true? We believe that the livestock market is really harmful for the environment status quo. The meat industry releases a lot of harmful substances, and as manure decomposes, it releases a lot of emissions that is also contributing to climate change. And all these harms are magnetized in the side proposition when they are less pushing to stop the eating meat for the point of morality, because vegans push 2 points. First, that animals are living creatures, so it is very immoral, and second, that it causes climate change. When one of these 2 points disappear, the result is lessening that, and the push of the vegan movement is less and less people will see the movement to push eating less meat. And when these animals are genetically engineered, this means that it will be impossible to release them in the future. So we will be that when they are released, like PETA does and whatnot, when they're in abusive conditions, it will be they will like run away and like try to die or whatnot, which is going to be very harmful at the status quo. And this is why we're so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that speech. Third prop, whenever you're ready. Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, cool. There are 3 things I want to talk about at the top of this speech. In this speech, first, I want to deal with their absurd third claim. Secondly, I want to talk about which side animals are going to get abused more, and lastly, I want to talk about which side animals feel pain more. Firstly, then, in terms of their third claim, they say that these animals are going, when they're genetically engineered, you're unable to release them, and that's probably not good. Firstly, these are farm cattle. They're probably not going to get released by anyone. Their entire existence on either side of the house is that they're being born, after a few years they die and they're being eaten by the rest of humanity. I'm unclear as to how this changes on either side of the house. This also takes down the principle of killing these animals, because the reason why we bring so many sheep and cows into existence every single year is to just kill them at some point in time to provide for humanity, and therefore I'm unclear as to how this principle changes on either side of the house. PETA is not going to free them insofar as they're farm animal and their purpose is to eat them. I don't understand the third argument. Firstly then, in terms of which side is going to have much more abuse of animals. At the top of this theme, I would observe that the vast majority of the things that opposition points out isn't mutually exclusive in this debate. We told you that there's a difference between the way animals died and the torture and the life that they go through in existence. Therefore, we can have ethical ways of killing these animals, so for instance, euthanasia, but crucially, these animals were still able to do things like feel pain on our side of the house, and so far as they were living in bad conditions, no thank you, they were still able to feel this sense of pain. And therefore, I'm unclear as to why you're going to have much more torture for these animals on either side of the house, because it is perhaps true that they're at the end of that they derive fulfillment from being eaten, but that does not mean that they derive fulfillment from the amount of torture that they go through on a daily basis, and that suggests that people still have empathy for these animals on our side of the house as well. Their mechanism was not mutually exclusive here. The second mechanism that they told you about in terms of why animals were going to suffer more on our side of the house was this idea that veganism existed and that was able to make a significant amount of change. Firstly, veganism gets laughed at by literally everyone. There are significant amounts of people who literally eat extra meat just to piss off vegans. I'm unclear as to how much vegans do in society. But secondly, vegans probably exist on our side of the house as well. Insofar as they see that the ways that animals are being tortured is incredibly inhumane, given that there's a distinction between the way that these animals live their lives and the way that they die, that's just that veganism was still likely going to exist on our side of the house. But thirdly, I would have said that veganism probably gets outweighed by things like farm lobbying that exists significantly on their side of the house. And that this didn't exist on our side of the house. They never dealt with this mechanism, and they probably had to in order for their claim to survive. So it is clear that they do not have any content supporting, no thank you, this idea that animals are going to have, that we are going to have much more empathy towards these animals on their side of the house. What did we tell you then in terms of why we had more why we cared about these animals significantly more? Firstly, we had a deeper sense of understanding. So oftentimes in society, we prioritize animals that are smarter in society, which is why we prefer things like dolphins over other animals or other marine life, which is just that we prioritize things that are more proximate towards us. Insofar as these animals are sentient beings, that they're more proximate towards us on an intellectual level, that is the point at which we're likely going to care significantly more about these animals. They strawman this claim significantly. That was, and you probably shouldn't let them do that. The second thing I told you in terms of why animals are likely going to suffer significantly more on their side of the house was that humans were likely going to consume significantly more amounts of meat. This claim is probably absurd for a few reasons. Firstly, there are health reasons as to why people do not consume meat in the to an overextent in the status quo, which is just that even if these animals are inhumane, that killing these animals is suddenly more humane on their side of the house. I'm unclear to what extent how much more animals are going to be eaten. But secondly, the vast majority of society still thinks that the reason why animals are being brought into society is to be eaten, and insofar as the vast majority of society does exist, vegans are an incredibly small portion of society. They can talk about things like Beyond Meat existing, but they're still an incredibly small portion of society. The fact that the vast majority of society still eats meat, I'm unclear as to what the increased amount is. These people probably do not feel any moral significance of killing animals, and I'm unclear as to what the moral distinction here then is in this debate. Lastly, though, we told you why there was likely going to be things like legal precedent that existed on our side of the house, but we also told you that there was likely going to be much more discussion about these things on our side of the house. So we told you that when there was active discussions about things like animal sentience on our side of the house, that was the point at which we had these ethical decisions as to whether or not treating these animals a certain way or another was justified. I'll take you at the end of this theme. These were all extraneous mechanisms that were never responded to by side opposition. So at the very least, it is equal in terms of the abuse that animals go through, but we gave to you much more structural reasons to suggest that animals suffer significantly less on our side of the house, and that is why you ought to prioritize our claim here. I'll take the PI before I move on to my second theme.
Given your own characterization, why will corporations be very empathetic on your side of the house to increase the animal rights?
They don't have significant amounts of power to do so, insofar as we have much more discussion in society about the way we treat animals. That was literally my response 30 seconds ago. I think there are other existing changes within society. This isn't changing the world from the status quo. It is two completely different worlds, and therefore you have to debate it like it is. Second theme then, in terms of whether or not animals were going to suffer more. The first thing that they say is that we have a tension in our case in the op second. They probably just didn't listen to our case well enough. This wasn't a tension. We said that animals can probably feel in the status quo in terms of they can feel things like pain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're sentient. We make them sentient on our side of the house. They're able to do things like think about their existence and things like that. Then they say that these animals are constantly going to think, I want to die, and that is bad. I would observe that firstly, it is probably not this active thought of I want to die that exists in society, but rather a more nulling sense that this is their end purpose in life, and that they still have a life. By the end of the day, that was the end point of their time, and therefore this was significantly better, and this is why we were able to win this debate. Because even if the abuse within animals was likely going to be symmetric, which we already won on that theme, even if there was more abuse on our side of the house, the way that animals perceive this abuse was likely going to be significantly better on our side of the house. Opposition gives to us no structural reason as to how they're able to solve for abuse on their side of the house. So on their side of the house, animals are still abused significantly, but crucially on our side of the house, they were able to do things like derive fulfillment from that, and that made the pain significantly less painful. So for instance, it is 4 a.m. and I'm debating for some reason. Even though that is incredible, and even though that is painful, I still derive fulfillment from it, and that suggested therefore that does probably work in the same sense. This suggested, therefore, that we probably still had fulfillment, that even if everything else in this debate was a tie, we still wanted the idea that animals probably felt less pain on a structural level, insofar as they were able to rationalize it and they were able to think about it to a much more significant extent. They just said, they said on this clash that this was principally unjust, But we told you that principle probably didn't apply in this debate, and so far it was probably symmetric on both sides of the house. At the end of this theme, the reason why we went on this theme of whether or not animals suffer significantly more is because opposition gives to us no reasons to suggest that animals don't suffer anymore apart from the ethical considerations, which we already have proven are symmetric in this debate. But insofar as they cannot control animals not suffering on their side of the house, when there are structural reasons that suggest that animals are still going to suffer on their side of the house, we ought to prioritize the animals themselves if everything else was going to be a wash in this debate. And because we were able to reduce the amount of pain that these animals went through, we're so proud to propose.
Great. Thank you for that speech. So I would like to call upon the third up whenever you're ready. We're here.
Sorry, my computer's taking a long time to load. I'll start my camera. Okay. I prefer she, her pronouns and verbal POIs. I'll begin my speech. Oh, actually, before my speech, I'm going to be talking about sexual assault in my speech, so trigger warning. And I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason why side proposition concedes that pyromaniacs should not be free to run away and start fires everywhere is because their desires are inherently unjustified. The reason why slavery is bad, even if all slaves enjoyed being slaves, is because the action itself is immoral. You cannot let side proposition boil down our principle into just saying that killing animals is wrong, because that was not the nuance of our principle. Instead, we told you that killing animals is inherently immoral, even if you have them be sentient, which is why we prefer our world in which the mechanisms to stop animal cruelty is beginning to arise in the status quo, and because of those reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose. Before anything though, a few responses. First of all, that veganism still exists on their side. First, this doesn't really make sense because the reason why veganism rose in our world was because people started to realize that these animals do not want to die and we were forcing them into it. But when these people, since the creation of the world, learned that these animals actually want to die, the purpose of veganism is gone. Second of all, that they treat animals better on their side too. I'm going to engage with this further in my clashes, but let's just be charitable and say that the veganism exists the same on their side. We still give a better life to these animals because they're going to have a painful life. As much as they hate dying on their side, they will hate living on our side as well. Third of all, that abuse would not feel as bad. They still feel physical pain, as side proposition conceded. It is just that they want to strive for the purpose of wanting to serve humans and sacrificing themselves for humans. That means that the experience is not going to be any better on their side of the house. It is just that the motives change. And because of those reasons, I don't see as to why they have a moral high ground in this debate, which leads me into my first clash of, is this principally justified? So they had 4 major points here. First of all, that you are happy because you fulfill desires for satisfaction. They said that this is why people feel masochistic and want to be on roller coasters. The difference here, as said by Eve, is that these are not your own thoughts. They have been placed in you by a third party. Your own feelings of masochism is something that you personally desire, but getting genetically modified takes away other options for you. This is why murder is still unjustified, even if the individual was conditioned into believing that they want to be murdered, because of the fact that this individual was conditioned into believing so. This is why cults are so bad in our side of the house, and either side of the house, because of the fact that even if these children did genuinely believe that this cult leader is God, they have been conditioned to believe so. And because of those reasons, I think that this want or this desire, even if they feel satisfaction the moment that they die, it is still not going to be justified because of the fact that this inherently desire is not theirs. There is no dignity on their side of the house, which is a mutual metric, because you are taking away any agency that they had even mentally. Before I get into my second point, sure, I'll take that POI.
So this isn't a policy motion. We're not giving them sentience, but also what do you say that animals do not deserve to be abused on your side of the house just because they're not sentient?
Okay. First of all, we have been engaging across the house in a world that does not have this. I don't understand as to why you're pushing that this is not a policy motion. Yeah, we agree that it isn't, and we have been engaging with your side of the house in which this has been since conception. Second of all, yeah, animals don't deserve to be abused on our side of the house. We've provided you a lot of mechanisms as to why there's going to be more empathy on our side of the house as comparative to yours. I'll engage with that later in my second clash. But Second of all, their second point was that animals feel pain on either side of the house, but they can rationalize their own pain on their side of the house. First, I think that if they can think about their own sentience, they have, I think we have the moral high ground, because no, on their side of the house, these animals have to go through every day, not fulfilling their purpose for days, months, and years, given their own mechanism about how you only feel satisfied once you die, once you feel a blade hit your head. Then we believe that necessarily these animals are going to have to suffer every day until they actually receive this satisfaction. This is going to be a net negative utility for this animal because of the fact that they are not going to actually be able to receive this satisfaction with their life until they are dead, which is going to be a long time away. We believe that there's more of an incentive to actually improve this animal's life on our side of the house, in which they do not in which they are going to provide more satisfaction in order to be living, given their own mechanism. But second of all, can animals talk? Just because they can suffer, just because they can rationalize their own pain in their head, doesn't mean they're going to be able to speak to these humans on their side of the house. That means that abuse that occurred on our side of the house is likely not going to be that much better, given that there's already a mechanism that says that these animals do want to die. So that means that even if there is a nuance that says that these animals do not want to feel pain, the humans are going to rationalize the fact that they want to kill these animals on either side of the house, but it's going to get compounded because now they have an explicit rationalization that these animals do want to die. Just because these animals can rationalize their pain additionally does not make their pain any better. This means that these animals are not going to be able, if you put a human who has committed a crime into a torture chamber where they get tortured every single day and every single hour, they may be able to rationalize their pain because they committed a crime, but that does not make this thing any worse, any better. Third of all, that there's more cows suffering on our side. Just because you genetically engineer livestock does not mean they do not feel pain, as I just said, and they want to die and maybe run into the mechanisms of our side of the house, which I just told you that more cows suffering is also going to exist on their side of the house when they suffer every single day to live. Finally, that they will use euthanasia. We have to look at the incentives of these livestock corporations here. When they know that these livestock can be highly profitable and want to die, do you think that they will use ethical methods such as euthanasia? No, thank you. So if we were to weigh this, we said from our first speaker that just because slaves are born to be slaves and nothing more, it does not make it morally just to have slaves, because proposition ignores the nuance of a principle. No matter if the pragmatics are mutually exclusive, we told you that taking away the dignity of animals at the end of the day is morally reprehensible in and of itself. We told you that even if they desire to die, that is an artificial desire that they did not actually place in themselves, which means that this desire is not justified at the end of the day. They cannot keep getting away with the fact that we told you that killing animals is wrong on our side of the house. Even if it is, we told you that their principle is a lot worse on their side of the house because you are actively taking away their rights and mentally, right? Second of all, though, on empathy. So they have a few points here. First of all, that humans don't eat more meat because of health reasons. The claim was that vegans are going to justify the fact they want to eat meat because most vegans are vegan because of the fact of moral failures or moral reasons. So because of that, it is more likely that more vegans are going to start eating meat, which compounds the harm on the environment that we told you about. Second of all, that euthanasia does not justify torture. I think morally, euthanasia does not justify torture, but corps are likely going to point to the fact that they want to die as an excuse if they want to characterize that they are bad. Corporations are profit incentivized given their own characterization, meaning that they're most likely going to lower the regulations towards these animals insofar as they're just going to want them to get fat in one place. They're just going to want them to not really get that much shelter or any rights because of the fact they want to die. Furthermore, people get euthanasia because they hate living, that they want to commit suicide. In side proposition, they're making the whole cow population miserable to the point where they want to die. And why is this good? Third of all, that corporations have more respect for animals. I think Eve's analysis about why if corporations don't have respect on our side, they don't have respect on their side either, is largely still unresponded to. But second of all, note how this impact is much better on our side, because empathy exists when you can relate to the wants of an individual, not if you feel proximate to them in some other way, such as sentience. For example, this is why the vast majority of the population holds empathies for videos of sick dogs found on the street, because they themselves would not want to have scabs grown over them and matted fur tugging at their skin, and they would not want to be in the place where they might die. However, when these animals are in a place where they want to die, this means that the mechanism that they are going through in order to die is likely going to be justified because of the justified in the animal's own mind, because of the fact that their end goal, their end destiny is to die. So in that matter, even if they feel the pain that they're going to feel, it is likely that they're going to justify that on their side of the house, which necessarily means that there's going to be less empathy because they want to die. Even if veganism does not happen on our side of the house, we take this impact home because at least more people on side proposition know that these animals do not want to die, and because of that, they're going to fight for more activism. They're going to fight for more change in the animal industry, in the meat industry, as we see in the status quo that has not been engaged with. For all these reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Great. Thank you for the speech. Up reply. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, am I both audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
All right. Okay, so my time will start in 3, 2, 1. Until the end of today's debate, side opposition was never able to characterize the true incentives of these meat industries and whether they will change. So let me tell you why we achieve this benefit much better and win today's debate in many different layers. Number one, on the issue of morality. What side proposition offers in today's debate is that these animals deserve to be treated lower than us because they cannot perceive anything per the first and second proposition speaker. Three issues here. Number one, we have told you that when animals are sentient, although their intelligence might not be as sophisticated compared to humans on side proposition, they still can perceive things and have feelings, right? This means that on their characterization, animals deserve fair treatment because they know that they want to die, because they know that they do not want to die, and they have feelings that they can perceive information. If they wanted to take this point, they needed to prove to us why the sentient does not exist on our side when animals literally have feelings they do not want to die, as we see in like documentaries or whatever where cows are crying before they get slaughtered, right? Secondly, they say that, and we believe that this basically means that animals should be free on their side then. Secondly, they say that animals have feelings and therefore will get good treatment anyways, making this action immoral. But when side proposition told us through all speakers about how mistreated these animals are, even when they have feelings already and humans are aware of this, why is this suddenly made moral, especially when they have feelings, right? If they want to solve the issue of animal abuse, side proposition should support a world where they're strengthening animal welfare instead of genetically trying to engineer these animals, meaning that this is a problem solution mismatch. Number three, we told you from our deputy speaker as to why side proposition cannot win the clash of who gives better lives to animals, because animals on our side do not want life. Animals on their side do not want life. They want death. As they live to die, happiness only exists when they reach the point of slaughter. We do not know how they are still arguing for the point of a better life for animals if the animal's life was miserable forever just until the moments that they were able to get slaughtered. Proposition is literally making animals want to get euthanasia just because humans want to consume them, although it is not a necessity. Secondly, on which side improves the treatment against animals. First, they said that there is an increase in the meat industry would not occur due to empathy. Two faults. Number one, we told you that side proposition is forcefully taking away the true purpose of the existence of animals, of being able to run around fields and all that, and that therefore is immoral. We received no response other than that, oh, they deserve it, when side proposition themselves say that they deserve to have their dignity limited. We do not understand why these humans will suddenly treat these animals with proper morality and dignity when our propositions themselves tell us that they deserve to live a life that is lower than us. Number two, we told you that livestock corporations are profit driven and therefore won't have incentives to stop their actions. They would rather want to create more livestock because they know anyways that all newly born livestock would want to die. Side proposition had to tell us why these corporations will be incentivized to take that stance, although they're profit incentivized, which they never did, meaning that this point does not stand. Secondly, on more legal framework due to active discussion. Speaker, in side proposition's world, from the very creation of the world and from the very get-go, no one viewed these animals as real beings that deserve a happy life with agency and dignity. When this is how side proposition characterized their whole world from the first speaker to the very last speaker, why will there be more legal framework to protect these animals? Side proposition failed to tell us why, even with the purposeful change in the purpose of animals' lives just for food, meaning that people have a great desire to kill all these animals, people would still be willing to provide a proper legal framework to properly protect these kind of animals, meaning that their case was an assumption at best. Thirdly, they talked about how vegans will still exist on their side. The only point on this comes from WIP, although we have talked about veganism from the very first speaker in our framing, which is far too late, Judge. But let's still compare this. We have told you that number one, with social media, there's a rise of veganism, and we see changes like writing names on dead cows that provide the meat and etc. Right? Secondly, we told you that the reason why vegans existed is because they know that the animals do not want to die. Side proposition said that vegans still exist with no further explanation. It was a one-liner. So even if we try to credit their response, we cannot judge. So therefore, side opposition strongly believes that we win today's debate on all clashes of today's debate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for the speech. With that, I will call upon the proper reply. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, 1 second. The first question I want to ask is which side gets better systemic change in the farming industry? And I want to begin by observing that ops world, which is by the way the status quo, is pretty terrible for animals, where we observed that there was a problem, that this is a world with massive trillion-dollar agricultural industries that have already entrenched their power, where this was a structural problem we identified, which makes it hard to get political change. It's unclear what a fringe vegan movement that most people hate is going to do. But also, even if you don't buy that response, just weigh the fact that we identified a structural problem where their mechanism was always reliant on individual change. We gave a structural reasons, they just said, but vegans. But also, animals are already suffering in their world under things like cramped enclosures, where they spend their days suffering from diseases or bloated livers, which occurs in the trillions across the board, where a few individual people going vegan has basically no impact against this massive structural issue. So they forget to contend with the fact that the status quo is incredibly far from humane. But what were our arguments then? The first thing we said was that people respect animals more. And their response down the bench was that, that respect goes away because they want to be eaten. But our argument was about their treatments before being eaten, and that the fact that that got more humane. Things that like better medical treatment or better living enclosures before the fact that they were slaughtered to be eaten. So just because animals want to be eaten doesn't mean they want to live in terrible, torturous conditions when they're alive. Where you pointed out in both second and third intuitively that most people recognize that like just because someone wants to commit euthanasia doesn't mean it's justified to torture them while they're still alive. It is rather intuitive for the vast majority of the population. They're not going to perceive these terrible conditions for animals before being eaten as justified. And this respect that increases under our side of the house translates to a more humane farming industry that allows animals to be farmed more humanely and with less pain. And the fact that they were never allowed to entrench their lobbying power through like cutting costs in the very first place. But the second mechanism we gave was that our mechanism of change wasn't reliant necessarily on politics in general, where we had legal metrics as well, where we could use existing precedents on giving rights to sentient creatures that are being instrumentalized in the scientific community that empirically doesn't exist for farm animals in the status quo. This is not an avenue that they could access in opposition to creating change. All they have are a handful of vegans. But secondly, on paying for these animals, even if we don't get systemic change, which arguably we do, but like neither does opposition. So even if this were the case and animals are abused on either side, at the very least we get more utility because animals are less unhappy in the short term. Where even if on either side they're suffering from cramped enclosures, which makes them unhappy in the short term, at the very least, the agony when they're eaten translates to joy under our side of the house. The fact that their short-term pain and their short-term suffering is mitigated because they know they have something to look forward to. So that allows them to mitigate their short-term harms and to rationalize in this way. So this means animals are happier under our side of the house. Weigh this against the principle that they gave you, which is rather quite strange. Where first they say it's wrong to genetically modify animals. We pointed out in the PY, this isn't a policy motion. There's no moral harm because we're not modifying them. That was insignificant. But secondly, their problem here is that the animals shouldn't think that their life purpose is to get eaten. And the analysis here is just an intuition pump about why we shouldn't let people sell themselves to slavery, even if they want it. But like it is equally morally wrong to enslave someone if they don't want it. And they concede in the POI that it's still wrong to abuse animals even if they're not sentient. So like in their slavery analogy, the animals are enslaved on either side of the house. And if eating animals is wrong, they're still being eaten on ops, so they still have that moral harm. It's unclear what the difference of sentience makes in this case then. So if it is true that both sides are principally wrong, what's more important then is to weigh on the utility that we give you. The fact that animals suffer less and are happier, but in the circumstances that they're stuck in. The fact that industrialized farming is always going to exist on either side, but at the very least there's less suffering and more net happiness within these creatures that still deserve dignity by virtue of being able to feel pain, feel joy, feel love on our side of the house. They deserve dignity. We prioritize it better on our side. We're very proud to propose.
Great. Thank you for the speech and thank you for the debate, everyone. You've come to the conclusion of the round. You can exit the room and all the best for the results. I would request the judges to stay in the room and the observers